Welcome to our CFO Collaborative. I'm Alan Murray, the CEO of Fortune. We all live at this remarkable moment in the history of business when three great waves of change are crashing down on all of us at the same time. The first is the wave of technology change driven by massive amounts of digitized data and powerful machine learning algorithms that have the potential to turn that data into intelligence. The second wave is a complete reset of how we work, precipitated by the work from home of the last year and now a return to work. And the third is this greatly increased focus on a broad array of stakeholder goals that go well beyond the traditional financial metrics that businesses have paid attention to for a century, and really in some ways are redefining the fundamental purpose of the corporation. And as CFOs, you all are on the shoreline where all three of those waves are crashing down at the same time. And it's really that led us to create this community of CSOs to help you share ideas, and CFOs to share ideas and best practices on how to deal with all of it. The topic today is the third wave, the promise and peril of ESG measures. And I want to start off, first of all, by thanking Workday for being our partner in this effort to build this CFO community, as well as our partner in today's session. This is the second of 4 of these CFO collaboratives in which you'll have a chance to engage with and learn from your colleagues across industries. And later in the program, we'll be joined by the 3 fantastic Fortune co-chairs of the effort. Fortune Senior Editor Lee Clifford. Lee, wave your hand there so everyone can see you. Fortune Senior Editor at Large, Jeff Colvin. Jeff, wave a little, yes. And Cheryl Estrada, who's the writer of our new and increasingly popular CFO Daily. If you haven't subscribed to it yet, please do so now. A quick note before we turn to our special guest. Today's interview sessions are on the record. They will be covered by Fortune reporters, but the working group discussions and the report backs from the working groups will all be off the record and they won't be reported on. We want to create an environment where all of you feel you have the opportunity to speak freely and candidly about the challenges you're facing. So let's get right to it. We're very lucky today. There are few leaders I know who are better placed to discuss our topic than Brian Moynihan. He headed up an effort with the World Economic Forum and the Big Four accounting firms over the last couple of years to begin to try and standardize a new set of metrics for stakeholder capitalism. And very happy that he could take the time to be with us today. Brian, thank you very much.
Good to be here. Alan, good to see you again.
So I want to dive right into the topic. I mean, and I guess my first question is this. You run a very big and a very complex operation. You oversee $2 trillion in assets. So how and why do you have the time to focus on standardizing ESG metrics?
Well, one thing I think it really comes back to why we do it at Bank of America is, we believe in the genius of the and, that you can deliver profits for your shareholders and deliver for society. And if you step back from where company's been around 230 years, we're only as good as the communities, the economic environments around us, and work with many of the companies that see here on the screen. We're only as good as society is. So if we have society doesn't make progress and grow, and the economy doesn't grow, banks aren't going to do well. So you can get there a couple different ways. But I think these are CFOs, and so we also have a unique position that we are a major research house, one of the best in the world, and we write on a lot of your companies. And we also have $3.5 trillion of investment assets in our company, which are stewarded. And so as investors and researchers working with institutional investors, it became clear that there was this demand on their investors, the people that give the money to the major investors and invest in all of you, that our clients would give the money to Merrill Lynch or our private bank, that they wanted more accountability in corporate world for what they're doing to help progress on stakeholder capitalism, on the Sustainable Development Goals UN, on just ESG matters. And if they weren't going to get it, they were going to start to vote with their feet. And it is technically possible that I can construct an index fund without any particular company in it. And then that's one thing. And then secondly, our research shows that companies don't do well or well enough. Let's just say that do well enough on ESG metrics. If you avoid those, you avoid the failures. So investors are starting to look harder and harder at these metrics as indicators of poor governance and performance in the company that may show up later. So you get at a lot of different ways why it's important to Bank of America, who we are as a company, how we operate, our employees, our customers want it. But more importantly, for this particular group, it might be around, speak on behalf of a lot of investors who put money in your companies, and you want to put money in your companies, put about the shareholders who are invested directly in your companies through our platforms. They're telling us they want us to understand this and understand what people are doing. And there comes in the rise for need for clarity on metrics.
Yeah, need for clarity is a good point to dig down on a little bit, because my sense is prior to the last year or so, it was kind of choose your own metric. you measured in the way that you choose to measure it, and made it very confusing for anybody on the outside trying to follow it. So describe a little bit what the task was for the IBC of the World Economic Forum that you chaired.
Well, coming at it as a journalist, you can't come at it saying you choose your own metric. Look, companies actually did more than that, but they were trying to respond to a bunch of requests to choose their own metrics. And so there were a lot of people who wanted to measure us or report on our measurements without ever having our input. You get report on by these various metrics providers and NGOs and others that did this on your environmental competency, on your human capital things, and you would never have input, and suddenly you get a rating, and you'd look at it and say, I don't recognize the company they're talking about. So what the IBC said is, with what we call the alphabet soup of metrics agencies out there and growing every minute, in 2020, but for the pandemic, there would have been 600 conventions in North America on environmental metrics.
Whoa.
And so
600.
And the team, the people on the screen here, the people at these companies that have to ultimately produce the information that goes into the public domain, and therefore you would have been asked by some subset of those to do it. So we at the IBC said, look, we've got to get control of this and drive an issuer-driven notion. Who better to do that than to turn to the big four accounting firms? Who better to define metrics that meet the sustainable development goals for somebody who's used to us reporting on financial metrics? So we got the big four to work together. They took all the metrics that are out there. They consolidated those metrics along the SDG platforms: people, planet, prosperity, principles of governance, 4 or 5 metrics in each. Then and these are metrics people can report on. If you look in our annual report, you can see our report right there. Some are broader, some are narrower. There's another 30 supplemental metrics. The principles were classic disclosure principles: disclose or abstain. If you couldn't calculate it, you didn't have to disclose it, but you had to tell people why you wouldn't do it. And so we got the big four to put those on the table. We got the IBC companies to look at them. We then worked a lot to try to figure out if they were the right ones. We had a lot of input, and now we have 100 companies, the largest companies in the world, have agreed to disclose, to use them as their disclosure practices. And then beyond that, we then started with the GRI and SASB and TCFD and all the other metric setters and said, you ought to consolidate and make it easier rather than have a bunch of things which are kind of the same but slightly different and had slightly different emphasis. And then we also started working with the public sector, the IFRS, who's working on a set of sustainability metrics. The Europeans are pushing hard on this right now. We started working with them to basically say, here's the private sector's view, and here's what we can do. And by the way, you don't have to guess at it. Here's 40 companies are actually already published on it. Here's another 60 they're going to do it. Here it is. So if you're going to write something up, why don't you write this up? Because we know we can then say to almost any company of any size, you got to be able to do this. If these 5 companies in your industry can do it, why can't you? So you can actually have a more of an issue-driven view. And that was the work we did, and the metrics are out there, and people are reporting on it.
It's a lot of metrics, though. Do you expect every big company to report on every metric?
Well, there's, look, the idea is if they can't, they should say why they can't. And that can come in 2 ways. One is it's a metric they'd rather not report on for some reason that makes it complex in a company. 2, they don't have the calculation done. So scope 3 emissions for something like that, that's hard. So that might be harder. Scope 1 emissions, frankly, it shouldn't be that hard for a company of the kinds of companies that are represented in the CFO forum here to do. If they're not, they're missing a bit what's going to happen to them anyway. So they should be preparing that. So even within a metric as simple to describe as your emissions, you have different parts of it you disclose differently. Diversity metrics. There's debate about disclosing your EO1 level diversity metrics. We disclose those. Some people don't want to. You can get to people say, I don't want to for whatever reason. But the reality is it's becoming the standard to do business to have to disclose those. So lead aside for foreign companies is a little different description of them. Basically, diversity of your management team. We had the one on taxes got a little interesting because your cash tax rate and your taxes is something that gets very complex and where we're in, and yet we got a metric in there for that. So we ended up, they're not that many when you really think about how many there could be, and how many we had to sort through to get to that.
And if you think about this as a journey that begins in the world you described, 600 different conventions for sustainability metrics, and ends in a coherent place where we have the kind of rigor around ESG metrics that we have around financial metrics, how much of the way on that journey have we traveled? Are we halfway? Are we a third of the way? How much more do we have to do?
Well, I think if you go back and study FASB and how it formed and stuff, it is an evergreen process. It doesn't stop and start. It formed out of a need to get a standard set of accounting metrics for accruals and things like that, and a cash flow statement that was consistent. So, I think in that regard, you're on the start of the journey. But on the other hand, have you thought through with a group of the big four accounting firms and their members, and thought through what would be a reasonable set to put in to be able to measure companies? So now, so I think we're pretty far along on that. Now the question is, what really changes dramatically is when you have somebody say from the official sector, this is what you'll do. Because once they say that, there isn't a choice for any public company or any, it happens, right? That's
do you think we're headed there?
I think you're headed there in Europe for sure. I mean, I think they're close to it. So if you think about the IFRS is already talking, you have sustainability metrics, platform just as well as you have international accounting metrics. And so I think then, the Securities Exchange Commission under Chair Gensler's movement is looking at not all the metrics are there, but a couple of the metrics, obviously around environmental and around human capital. I think the two metrics that will make it to the forefront fastest in the official sector. But the point really was to the issuers, which is, let me flip it around, is how many times that you're in with a bunch of investors and somebody asks you about this and you rattle off all the things they say, well, we didn't know you did that, or we didn't understand that. This gives you a chance to objectify that discussion, which is, if I put the metrics on the table and I disclose against them across time, an investor like our group that looks at either on the institutional side, advising institutional clients, Candace Browning Platt's research platform, or in our, the group that works with Merrill in the private bank, they can sit there and say these companies are above the bar. The idea here is, if you said company has to be a top, there's only going to be one, all the money goes to one company. But the idea, if you had 10 companies in the industry and the bar was X, it appears that it's good enough, and 8 of them are above it, the money will shift away from the other 2. And so it'll self-police itself, even if it doesn't become part of the official metrics, because the investors are now trying to substantiate how they are investing consistent with ESG principles, because the people who give them the money want them to do that.
Yeah,
that's what what everybody forgets about all this is it gets caught up in who's making the decision, but it's their clients telling them you have to do this, and it's our clients telling us you have to do this, especially around the environment and becoming more prevalent around human capital. Diversity.
Yeah, so you said especially about the environment. Let's dig down on that one a little bit. I mean, I certainly, as an observer, have a sense that we're at some kind of a turning point or an inflection point here, that the drumbeat has really been building strongly in the last year or two, and environmental goals have gone from being something that are done off in a corner by a sustainability officer to a fundamental strategic effort that has to be managed by the CEO and the CFO. But you are in a better place to judge that. How do you view the pressure now to meet sustainability goals?
Well, it's a high pressure for us because the investors we have want us to meet them, and then the customers we have want us to meet them, and our employees want us to meet them. At the end of the day, we employ 200,000 people who believe our company should be contributing. So we're net zero by 2050. We have $1 trillion of financing we're going to do for all these clients to help them make the transition, and we do lots of things around that. But the real thing that's been going on Alan, you talk about, and I'm working with a group called the SMI, and work with a group called GFANS, which is going to COP26, which is the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero. We work with the World Economic Forum and all these groups. But the basic set of principles is, as companies, as private sector, public sector companies, or companies period, commit to net zero, that causes a massive movement in the supply chain. So when a company says, I'm going to be net zero, and then turns to suppliers, and you've seen that in the auto industry famously with Porsche and some other people, it says all of you have to be net zero also. That then starts to shake out to be competitive, even for private companies, which might be supplying in, that the commitments by these big companies that now cover substantial 60% of the emissions of the world are covered by net zero commitments today. Now, how they're going to get there is all of us working on it, all of us driving it, in our case, with our particular role, helping to finance it. But you're going to start to run into more and more customer demand. And so if you're a B2B customer and you're supplying in, or consumer demand, if you do something with consumers, they are going to want to know how you're going to get to net zero, or else they're going to buy their product from someone else. And
yeah, the supply,
that's going to force activity fast.
Yeah, the supply chain effect is the one that seems, I mean, it's almost geometric, right? You have a few big companies that make the commitment to get the carbon out of their supply chains, and they turn to suppliers, and they're an important customer. You really start to see some pretty big movements happening.
You're not going to get this done unless the private sector does it. It takes $6-7 trillion a year to do the SDGs. It takes about $2 trillion of it to do the environmental side. And I don't think the total amount of charity in the world is about $1.2 trillion a year. So 800 billion of that's the US, which is wonderful stuff, but isn't enough. That all the foundations, endowments of the world are around $1.5 trillion or so. If you empty them all tomorrow, that can get you through maybe a year. The governments are all running deficits. They don't have the money. So where's it going to come from? All of us. It's going to come from everything you do, not some charitable commitment. So it's going to come from you changing how you buy power. It's going to come from you changing how you, if you use steel in your production, how you demand that those steel producers get you a little cleaner steel incrementally. And the other fundamental principles is we as industry, we as a private sector, we as, talking to the public sector, we've got people to agree it's a transition. So even the hardest to work on companies, companies that produce hydrocarbons as their business, or companies that you have very intensive things, have to be given a chance to move forward, as do countries have to be given a fair chance to move forward without having to let all the rich people say, well, we did it this way, you can't follow us. So, you've got a pretty good agreement, but you really got a real agreement the private sector has to drive it. And the way it's going to get driven is through this flywheel. If you know the Jim Collins analogy, or think about a windmill, maybe an environmental, on the inside hardly looks like a moving, on the outside it's going around a really fast pace. It's going to be by every one of you taking a little bit here, a little bit there, and that adds up to the ability to build a huge alternative power plant in North Carolina by us committing to take alternative power, because we have to get our direct scope 1 down on power, or $100 million of power spent a year. That pile that up, that drives it. And so I agree with you. It's going to come from all the different public sector companies, all the bigger companies making these commitments and driving it through the supply chain. And then, frankly, people giving their expertise and helping people learn.
Yeah. Change the topic a little bit. I mean, another area where there's been a lot of focus is racial equity and economic opportunity. How do you see the progress on measuring and holding companies accountable on those?
Well, I think there's a phraseology it's developed called the window and the mirror. So the mirror is what you do in the company. So that's your diversity programs, that's your representation statistics, and then your accountability around inclusion in the company and equity. And so first it's having representation top to bottom, it matches it, and then it's how you pay everybody for equal pay for equal work. And then it's frankly how you develop. And so I think this is gonna be a required disclosure for everybody. I think it's already out there. Most of you probably do it. There's a need to do that because especially the companies of the size and scale and the pay capacity that the companies on the screen have. We are companies of opportunity to, if we get the earned income from our companies, it will create middle class and above middle class people. And that's what we have to do. And so if we have good diversity, that means society moves together. Then you flip to what you do in the wind, look out the window, what do you do? And for us as a bank, we're slightly different, but we obviously make small business loans and did PPP, and we're the largest small business lender and things like that. But where we saw a real hole was on entrepreneurial capital. And so we went out and did a couple things. One, the MDIs, the minority depository institutions, we basically invested 5% of equity in anybody that wanted 140 companies. We'd said we give them 5% equity. So they would then keep working in the communities they work in. The CDFIs, which are community development financial institutions, we have $1.8 billion into them to do it. But what we really found was unique is in the private equity business, there was a dearth of funds for not the fintech company, the biotech company that's going to get money from anybody, but there's a dearth of funds for the classic sort of operating company, 3, 500, 7,000, 100,000 chip size that was missing. And so we went out and said to a bunch of, go find us private equity firms that are women and BIPOC sponsors, private equity players who invest in women and BIPOC companies. We've now invested in 100 of those around the country, and that then creates entrepreneurial capital, both for the private equity sponsors and for the companies. And so you're trying to think of how you create opportunities to have broader opportunity among BIPOC community people in America, especially. And it's clear that there needs to be more private equity capital. And then we use our supply purchasing and stuff to also help, as many of you do. We do $2 billion with minorities, with diverse suppliers. So you have to think about everything. Starts with how you run your company and then turns to how you impact society.
I want to open it up to questions from the group. You can either, raise your actual hand or raise a virtual hand in the reactions or put a question in the chat, but would really like to hear both your comments and your questions for Brian. And while they're doing that, Brian, let me just ask you, everything we've been talking about for the last 20 minutes really does put a huge new increased burden on CFOs, on the people in the position of the people on this call. What's your advice to them on how to deal with it? One of the fears that's been raised is that if you have too many targets, you don't hit any of them.
Right.
How do you suggest they deal with that?
Well, just staying really specifically on the metrics in the IBC, we built them off the architecture that we thought was comfortable for companies like all of you and us, right? Which is real metrics that you can really calculate that are material by definition, and then can be measured over time. And so, so we took into account. We recognize that, if your CEO is like me, he'll call up, Paul D'Onofrio in our case, and say, who's this MSCI that rated us on something, on ESG here? Why'd they do it? And suddenly everybody has to scurry around. This is a take control of the question, which is, this is what we're going to do. This is how we're going to deliver it. This is how you're going to measure us. This is a specificity to it. And it's enough specificity. That's a key part of it. And if you don't do that, it's just going to keep coming at you every day. So I think you're critical to it, but we built these things, frankly, with a view in mind of straightforwardness. Nothing's ever simple, and real calculable and real deliverable into the public domain that, accountants and others could look at and say, I see where that number comes from. It can be audited to the source element of it, and it can be delivered, and it can be routinized. And by the way, it's actually important to the question.
Yeah.
Which is the
Harmit Singh, did you have a comment or a question?
Sure. First, thank you, Alan and the team for putting this together. And Brian, applaud you for the leadership in trying to get standardization and disclosure. My question, you highlighted a couple of times the leadership that's being displayed in Europe and the IFRS. And Klaus and I, we belong to an organization called A4S. We kind of co-lead the US chapter. We have been engaging with the SEC and trying to engage with the FASB to try and get standardization across the US and corporations in the US. Would love to hear, how you and your leadership is engaging with regulatory bodies within the US, because getting this standardized and probably across different industries, because every industry is a little different, is important. In our views, it's going to take time, but it's important to try and get some consistency. So love your insights or thoughts on that.
Sure. So we are engaged with, through the official body, the IBC, through with groups, the accounting firms individually are engaged their offices into the Washington process and the Division of Corporate Finance and into the SEC. We've talked to the SEC. We put writings in, for lack of a better term. We're working with the Business Roundtable to say, here's something, and they've been looking at it. They haven't yet adopted something. They said, we believe in stakeholder capitalism. And what we've been saying to the team there is, here's a set of metrics, a lot that you have a common set of constituents, and they're working on what they want to do there, but they recognize the value of the metrics. So, and so we're going from, it's really from group to group to group to try to push. And so there isn't, the SEC has told us all they're going to promulgate rules on environment, or additional NPRs on environment and human capital, environment in particular, as part of the new administration's executive order platform and things, and that's they're going to do it, and we've talked to them, and so I think we're just going everywhere we can. There hasn't been, to my knowledge, a lot of engagement with the FASB yet. Part because I just think I don't know. It's the IRFS took the view that we needed to broaden out. We would take our mandate broader. I'm not sure that there's a little bit different feeling for that in the United States, honestly, but we'll see it play out. But yep. And then by the way, we're engaged with GRI and SASB heavily, saying consolidate, make it straightforward. Let's agree to something, so then you can actually spend the time actually trying to improve the metrics than debating whether this metric's right or wrong. And I would caution that you as CFOs, just the amount of, if you say you do this in the environment and it's not in metrics that are understood and agreed to by other people, you're going to be spending a lot of time saying, that is, not right. It's not calculable. It's greenwashing. You'll be responding to all things. Where if you come in, and by the way, the metric here is TCFD disclosure, so it's not exactly something that people haven't done. If you get to common, the more common we are, the harder we are to come to us as a share owning platform, or to the governance committee as the major shareholders, and say, we're right, but everybody else is wrong. When you say, no, we're right, and you can see us along with the other companies in my industry, and we do as well as any of them, they can then stick with you. That's the key, is to try to get enough commonality. So it's really SEC and stuff. I'd welcome the FASB to take a look at it. I think it's just going to take, because it is a step beyond traditional financial metrics that you have to get people to make that bridge. In Europe, they did.
Brian, I promised to get you out of here at 3:30, but really appreciate you taking the time to be with this group today and to talk through this. It's obviously an issue that's not going away.
No, and I thank all of you for your attention. If you have any questions, feel free to email me directly. My email is in the public domain. You can get a hold of me, and we can link you up with some of the team working on it. But thank you for your time today, and I appreciate all you do for our world and making it a better place.
Great. Thank you, and thanks for being with us. And now it's my pleasure to introduce the CFO Collaborative Co-Chair and Fortune Senior Editor, Lee Clifford.
Thanks, Alan. And before we get into our next conversation, we wanted to take a moment to poll all of you in attendance here on the following question. What challenges does your organization face in synthesizing or extracting ESG performance in areas such as greenhouse gas emissions, workforce diversity, social inequity? And we'd like you to select your top challenge. We're going to put up a slide here. You can't choose all of the above. You have to choose your top challenge. Lack of data consistency or quality. Data management is too resource or time intensive. Data housed in disparate systems with different business owners. Uncertainty about which metrics to use, or lack of expertise in ESG topics. So we'll give everyone a few minutes, or just a minute, to vote.
Are you going to play music while they're voting, Lee, or do you want me to sing?
I hope I don't have to sing. You can sing, Alan.
I don't think anyone wants that.
No. All right. So we'll see. This will be good for us. We'll see where your pain points lie. Maybe it'll prompt some story ideas. Okay. Once you've voted, we'll go over the results. Okay. All right, the results are in, and we have a winner. data housed in disparate systems with different business owners. So I think there are probably some legacy systems that are not doing the job. That's good to know. All right. And with that, we're so lucky to be joined by our next speaker, Robert J. Jackson, Jr., who is a professor of law at NYU School of Law. Robert also served as SEC Commissioner from 2017 to 2020. And in addition, he is the new father of a 2-week-old baby. So I don't know which is harder, being an SEC Commissioner or a parent to a newborn.
Listen, overseeing 30 trillion was easy.
Yeah.
I have new and profound respect for all parents out there.
Totally. It's a different kind of challenge. So Professor Jackson, thanks so much for joining us. Let's just dive right in. I mean, I think what we would all love you to do is look into your crystal ball. You've been in the room where it happened. So tell us what you think is likely to be coming out of the SEC in terms of forthcoming rules and changes.
Well, first of all, thanks, Lee, and thanks to you, Alan, for a fascinating discussion with Brian Moynihan. Let me just say at the start how delighted I am to be here in this forum, and I'm really here to hear from all of you. So, Lee, I know we're going to leave some time for questions with the audience. I'm happy to answer any questions I can about what the future looks like at the SEC. Lee, let me get right to your question and just say that you should expect in the next 6 months out of this SEC, I think, a proposal to require disclosure related to climate impacts of particular issuers. Talk about what the details will look like there, what measures or metrics are likely to be included and which ones are less so. But I think a climate disclosure rule is likely to come before Christmas. Second, I think a human capital rule is likely to come before Christmas, requiring some disclosure about workforce diversity, about workforce pay and labor-related issues. And then finally, I think you can also expect to see some developments in the crypto space. My guess is that Chair Gensler, who has studied that area extensively, he's made now a couple of public statements that make clear his view that there's a need for investor protection in that area. We can talk more about the details there too, but I think those three things are likely to be coming. And if I were a CFO, I'd be especially thinking about items 1 and 2, because those are items that may well find their way into a 10Q or a 10K in your future. And for that reason, happy to focus on those this afternoon.
Absolutely. And you also said that you think there are going to be some accounting standards that are going to have to change coming up. What do you see happening there?
Oh, I sure do. I mean, I think everybody in this conversation knows that the SEC can put out all the rules it likes, but at the end of the day, someone's got to count this stuff. And what you'll be doing, I'm sure, is engaging someone, whether the Big Four or one of the boutiques who have focused on climate and human capital related measures, to work through your organization with your teams and get those numbers right in a fashion that makes you comfortable signing on the dotted line when 10K time comes. For that reason, Lee, I think there's going to have to be some generally accepted standards on that subject. Brian talked a little bit about this. I think the question is what those standards will be and where they'll be drawn from. No shortage of cooks in that kitchen, you all know. There's the IFRS, of course, that has its own view and will be coming out with more detail in this subject in about November of this year. Their Sustainable Standards Board is looking to do this on an international basis. Of course, here in the US, we've got the Sustainable Accounting Standards Board, SASB, which has worked with many of you in this room for a decade or more on fine-tuning standards focused on material matters in the climate and human capital space. We could see some drawing from there. And then, Lee, I have to tell you, a question we could ask and that my former colleague, Commissioner Ladd Roisman, has already insightfully asked in speech is who's going to make those standards? Is it going to be the Financial Accounting Standards Board? I mean, you know, I like visiting Connecticut as much as the next guy. Not a ton of client scientists at FASB these days. And so I wonder a little bit about whether they have the necessary expertise. My own 2 cents, Lee, would be that we're going to have some kind of accepted rules of that road because no SEC rule, everyone in this room knows that the SEC rule, whatever it asks for, is the beginning, not the end of the disclosure discussion. That helps you and your lawyers understand what you need to find out, but it's the accountants who are going to help you drill down and make sure you get it right.
Yeah, absolutely. Talk a little bit, has COVID kind of changed the trajectory of where we are on ESG reporting, or would we basically be here if there wasn't a global pandemic?
Well, I think naturally any organization, the SEC included, is working very differently now than it was a year and a half ago. I think we all are. But I expect those initiatives to be on track. And let me just say something. You know, I've known Gary now for more than 10 years, when he was at the CFTC and I was at the Obama Treasury during the financial crisis. This is a former Goldman partner who gets things done. So I can tell you, you know, look, there's the pipe at the SEC is limited, but he's going to push as much through it as he can. Now he's going to have consultation. It's going to be a proposal on which there will be comments. There's going to be extensive opportunity for all the folks in this room to share their views with the SEC about what makes sense and what doesn't. And I think that you all should. But I think you should expect to know a lot more about all this before Christmas time.
Wow. So any advice for maybe some CFOs on the call who didn't necessarily, ESG maybe wasn't a big part of their career at the beginning of it? What's the best way to get up to speed and become an expert in this stuff as it becomes increasingly important? I mean,
Lee, I just want to say, let me just confess. So, you know, I'm a Irish Catholic, so I'll just confess. I don't know anything about. I mean, where would I have learned? I mean, I was an investment banker at Bear Stearns. Not my fault, by the way. Then I was a corporate lawyer at Workday. Like, I'm a law professor. You know, I'm a brand new and not very effective dad. Like, you know, there's no reason for you to be a CFO at the head of an organization of the sophistication that yours is, and to have an extensive background on that subject. So I think everyone would have that question. I sure do. And I think the answer is you're bringing in people and teams that can give you this advice so you can get up to speed. And my sense is CFOs, you know, C-suites across the S&P 500 are doing exactly that. They're bringing in professionals who've got exposure to these measures, whether it's on the Big Four side, or as I say, there's a bunch of boutiques who do this well, who are getting in the room and briefing CFOs up on understanding these things. And I think more and more, by the way, a CFO needs to know this, not just because you're going to have it in a Q or a K, but because investors are going to ask it. And you're going to want to be able to have ready answers, if for no other reason than you want to understand how your organization is functioning in response to good and hard questions from the BlackRocks, Vanguards, Fidelities, and even the pension funds of the world. So, Lee, I think the answer is that people are using professionals and teams to get up to speed. I think also people are bringing in folks. There are a lot of C-suites that are bringing in full-time advisors on these things, just because they want to have that base covered. And if you're an organization of significant scope, if you're in a global scale, and you need to understand your supply chain situation and the labor issues on the other side of the world, you might very well need a professional who's tasked with managing these issues full time. Now, that's not going to be everybody, but it's going to be lots of folks. And I know people who are engaged in that search right now.
Well, I like the parenting analogy. You basically know nothing and you're thrown in and you figure it out, or pay people to help you. I imagine that you're probably, you know, counseling CFOs to stay calm, but is there one thing that you actually feel like they should be staying up late at night worrying about right now? Like, what should be freaking them out?
You mean other than the global pandemic?
Yeah, put that aside for a second.
Yeah,
and I mean, number two.
I mean, look, I think, first of all, there's a tendency, anytime the rules of this game change, anytime the SEC is looking at significant initiatives. And by the way, I understand this. I was on the other side of this conversation for most of my career. Anytime the SEC announces, hey, we're the SEC and we're here to help, it's very natural for any finance professional to say, you know, as Reagan might have, please don't. And I fully understand that. But I'm going to give you 3 reasons, Lee, why I think in a year, if you invite me back, folks will be saying that it's better, not worse, that the SEC's provided some guidance here. First of all, unlike me in parenting, folks are already dealing with this. I don't think there's anyone on this call who's not getting climate questions these days. Now, you might not like them. You might not feel you know the answers. You might not think they're especially fair questions, but you are getting asked. And the SEC is going to provide some rules of the road for how to answer them. And that might be helpful, more so, not less so, number one. Number two, any good CFO knows that the real risks in an organization are ones that you can't measure. Once the SEC gives a sense for how we should think about measuring this, you all are going to be able to get to work on measuring it. And that's what you do best. So I think there might be some help in having a federal regulator point you to an agreed upon measure. And then finally, I don't know about you all, but the inconsistency and lack of comparability in measures in this stuff drives me nuts. You can look at, I can look at two different climate indices and have someone tell me this firm is one of the worst firms in the world and one of the best firms in the world. And it's very hard for me to know the difference. Getting the SEC to point us to an agreed upon approach will have the benefit of putting you and competitors on a level playing field, so that you're the person across the industry from you who's not doing these things as expensively or as thoughtfully or as carefully as you are won't be able to point to some bespoke index and say, see, I'm a good guy too. No, the SEC will have said, these are the measures we're going to use, and you'll have that to point to. So again, look, I understand. I was, I did tech IPOs before we expense stock options. And when the SEC said, hey, a great idea, we're going to expense stock options, I thought, oh my God, what a disaster. In retrospect, I'm glad we expense stock options. And I bet that a bunch of folks in this room, although they're not like inviting the SEC in the door to examine their climate books, I bet that in a couple of years, we'll be glad that the federal regulators finally got in this space where investors and companies have been for years.
Yep. That's a great point. So one of the things that you've written a lot about is what happens when an activist investor joins a corporate board. You want to tell us a little bit about how that usually goes down? Are there any silver linings there?
Oh, yeah, sure. Any of you who's at an organization that's a public company, especially ones that are mid to small caps, you know that you'll often face, you constantly face the risk that an activist is going to come calling. And when that happens, increasingly, what's been happening in many boardrooms is the activist demands a seat on your board. And it's funny, when I first learned corporate law and when I was a banker, what happened with an activist was a proxy fight, right? They ran against your directors and it was a war and everyone spent a ton of money and the lawyers got paid and no one was happy. Now, the most common outcome is a settlement, peace. The company says, all right, we'll take two people and put them on your board. A lot of folks think that that's a good thing. Now, I believe in management accountability. I think having activists on your board can be a useful thing. But in the paper you're referring to, Lee, what we show is that activists who are generally finance professionals are very leaky when it comes to corporate information. What we show is that if you put an activist on a board, the likelihood that information will leak out of that company before it hits the wire on an 8K or a public disclosure rises quite substantially. Now, nobody should be surprised to find this out, right? And I'm not sitting here arguing that these guys are insider trading. What I'm saying is that they're finance professionals who know a thing the rest of the world doesn't, and that tends to find its way into the market one way or another. So Lee, what I argued in that paper is that we need a lot more governance protections if we're going to invite activists into the corporate boardroom this way. We need confidentiality protections. We need executive sessions in which activists are not privy to certain confidential information, because it's not good for anybody, not the company, not its shareholders, and certainly not the management team, to have activists out there in the market with information the rest of the world doesn't have.
Absolutely. I want to invite everyone to put their questions in the chat if they have something to ask Professor Jackson. And in the meantime, I think we have Emma Stewart on from Netflix. I'd love to, if you want to unmute yourself, I'd love to hear a little bit more about what Netflix is doing right now when it comes to ESG and what you guys are working on.
Sure, happy to. And I have an answer to your question, Leon. What's the number 2 thing that should keep CFOs up at night?
I want to hear it.
Anyone who read the IPCC report that came out on Monday is still trembling. And Mark Carney describes it as essential boardroom reading. So if you haven't put that in front of your CEO or board, I highly recommend doing so. And I'm hoping that someone other than myself who took a stab at writing an executive summary of it will do a better job. Hopefully Fortune can take me up on that. But it is absolutely jaw-dropping, the disruption to the global economy that is anticipated as a result of essentially locking in 1.5 degrees of global warming over the next 20 years. So we now understand that that's inevitable. And the real question is, how much of the most dire and catastrophic loss is preventable? So that's what the calculus has to be about. And that's why I welcome, as Professor Jackson was talking about, clear rules of the road from the SEC on what how we structure and how we classify climate risk. At Netflix, we are not a heavy industry or manufacturing or fossil intensive company. However, when you start looking, you start to find risks in perhaps unanticipated places. For example, when the grid goes down in Texas, I can assure you no one is watching Netflix. And I can assure you that the more you don't watch something, the less sticky you become as a customer. Have we quantified that yet? No. Are we working on it? Absolutely. We are also quantifying things like the number of times wildfires have interfered with production. That is our core business, making television and film. And unfortunately, that number is going up every year and in every region. So those are the kind of obvious physical risks, but we're also seeing transition risks when it comes to technology transition, regulatory and policy risks in different places with different metrics and different disclosure requirements. So myself as a sustainability officer could, in the worst case scenario, spend all day simply reporting back to investors on their long list of perfectly well-intentioned questions. But instead, I would like to have that single source of truth. Here's what we want to know. Here's how you can compare it. And that level playing field that Professor Jackson was talking about. Because right now, and I think, Alan, you put it nicely, you might not recognize yourself in the way that your company is being portrayed. And that's not fair to anyone, in particular, those who have invested their hard-earned salaries in some of the big banks that are running those analyses. So we have, as a company, made climate change our most important ESG focus area, and we have set a net zero emissions by next year target, which you have to pause and just appreciate what that entails and how hard the team is sweating to get us there. But what we have noticed, and I liked, Alan, the way you put it, that once you engage the supply chain, it really becomes a geometric change. We have noticed that just the act of asking our vendors the question, do you have a science-based target? That takes on just a multitude of ripple effects out into the supply chain. So even just that conversation is well worth the effort, and actually has led to improvements in relationships with some of our vendors. So I can highly recommend, if you haven't already, setting a ambitious and comprehensive net zero target, anchoring it in a science-based target, and then being very clear in your communications out to the industry and to your consumers what that includes, what that excludes, and why. I'll leave it there.
Thank you. No, that's great. And I know Klaus Agard, the CFO of Mars, is also on the call. Klaus, we just have 1 minute left, but if you want to give us a couple thoughts about what's going on at Mars, we would love to hear from you as well.
Yeah, thank you. Great to be with you all, and thanks for organizing this. Great to hear your input there, and maybe just building on that. We are at Mars Incorporated, although we have a big service business, we are fundamentally an agriculture-based, product business, and in companies like ours, 90% of the climate footprint sits outside our factories or our direct supply chain. So that is a huge focus that we've been, attacking for a number of years, and just recently, together with, PepsiCo and McCormick, we launched an initiative on bringing our suppliers into a climate transition as well, because we did go out and talk to our top 200 suppliers and found that only 10% of them actually has science-based targets. And we have no hope of achieving our commitments with extensive scope 3 reductions, which is really our focus, without them playing along. So that is a major initiative where we've had some breakthrough on palm oil, and now we're attacking a broader piece of our supply chain. So that's a big focus, along with social issues, I have to say, is also very important at Mars.
Wonderful. Well, we'll get to chat more in the breakout session.
Yeah.
For now, Professor Jackson, thank you so much for joining us. That was a great discussion, and we will definitely take you up on your offer to come back in a year, and we'll see if everyone is happy about the changes that you've predicted.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks again.
Well, folks.
We're going to move into the next part of our program, the interactive working group sessions. In just a moment, we're about to send everyone into 4 different breakout rooms. Each of these rooms will be hosted by a Fortune editor together with a subject matter expert on the topic of ESG. As a reminder, this part of the program is going to be off the record. And as we shared with you before this gathering, the prompt we will all be working on is the following. What best practices for ESG reporting do you anticipate will enable open and actionable ESG disclosure? What role can the private sector play to further standardization. So please get involved, get engaged. We'd love to hear everyone's voices in this next part of the session, and we will have our report backs here at 4:15 Eastern.
We hope you all made meaningful connections as you dug into our prompt in your working groups. We want to give the working group discussion leaders the floor for a couple of minutes to report back on what happened. Leaders, you'll have about 3 minutes to share what you discussed. I'll start with Klaus to kick us off in telling us what you discussed in your working group.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Cheryl. Good to meet you again. I think, good discussion and some great point. I think there were 4 kind of main areas that we were discussing. One was, a lot of big audacious goals are being, set out there right now by lots of companies. We certainly said more often than not with not a clear path necessarily on how to achieve them, and as we know for most of the companies also here is they're very long-term goals. So we really think and encourage the CFOs and the CFO community to step up and really, put some robustness behind, those goals, the plans to get there, and the investments that it's going to take, to actually, achieve it. We had a good discussion about, sort of the rush to standardize these measures and come up with some standard, which is a great thing. We all applaud that. However, we need to do our very best to make sure that these standards are meaningful. And as we all know, what you measure is what you manage. And if you focus on the wrong measure, you're managing the wrong thing. And there were some example of, in other countries than the United States where standards have been enforced, where, maybe, the way it's calculated and the focus of that metric, is driving potentially the wrong behavior. So a big watch out, to think about, and possibly for any of you that interact with regulators to feed that in, and one great suggestion is, which I'm very much also personally in favor of, is to start smaller and let it grow over time. Really focus on the few things that really matters. And I think there's a lot of movement that, while there are many important topics, probably climate is top of the pile. So let's encourage that we start some of this standardization of metrics and disclosure on a few important ones, and then it can grow over time. And then really get industries to work together, maybe coming back to the point of making sure these measures are meaningful. Industry stepping up and really helping define what is the critical things, to focus on. So those were probably the four areas that I would say were key tenets of the discussion we had.
Oh, that's excellent. Thank you for sharing. A lot of great information was discussed in that session. Next, I'll call on Ann Dennison to share what you discussed in your section.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Cheryl. So we started out the conversation really talking about the evolution of stakeholder capitalism and really how the pandemic has accelerated the focus on it. With companies, recognizing the need to act consistently with their values and to for the benefit of their employers, and to encourage their suppliers to act, consistently with the company's values. So, and then we sort of shifted into talking about the importance of building ESG into the company's strategy, sort of from the top down. And on the reporting front, as we wait, at least in the U.S., for a regulatory framework around reporting, that companies should look at their public reporting, and strive to be clear, with respect to their, they look at their peers and their sectors and look, to standardize against, metrics that make the most sense there, and strive to make them easy to understand, and to do that on a consistent basis, with transparency, at the same time of year, that sort of thing. Really, using the same level of rigor that they use for, other financial reporting. building that sort of construct. And we talked a bit about, also exploring, opportunities for automation. And, one of the things that we saw in the poll was the fact that the data is sitting in many different places. So how do we improve, the access to that data and ultimately, the quality of it, so that, it can go into those, publicly reported, reporting documents, at the sort of audit level quality. And the last thing we talked about was just, thinking about on the back end of this, how to compare companies in a consistent way within their industry and sector, and how important that's going to be, on a go-forward basis to really, evaluate the, ESG success of any particular company.
A lot of details discussed there. Thank you so much, Anne. Next, I'll move to Julia. Can you share what you discussed in your section?
Sure, happy to, Cheryl. There were really three areas where our discussion hit on in our room. The first was around the imminent SEC requirements that we heard about in plenary, these being right around the corner. That triggered a bit of a twofold reaction in our room. On the one hand, there was enthusiasm that there will be standardization and a bit more structure, for all of us to comply with, and that was seen quite positively. On the other side, there was also some exploration of what it'll be like to face more of the measures that Anne is actually quite familiar with in terms of disclosure explain, and what that'll mean for companies that are going to need to explain because they're not yet ready to make a disclosure. And what level of scrutiny that will require from investors to really understand what is a good explain response versus one that is dismissing the importance of this metric. The second area that we touched on was really around the enablers that will be required to make this happen. And I think similar to the discussion in Anne's group, folks mentioned the importance of having tools and a workflow that will really connect financial data with some of the people data, other corporate governance data that exists in disparate systems that are simply not talking to one another. In addition to this, there was a discussion around the need for greater focus on advisory in ESG, hiring talent that actually understands the ESG landscape, understands how to implement ESG programs and initiatives, how to report against them, as well as in sectors where there may be a bit less structure and a bit less movement around ESG, actually exploring collective action to put frameworks in place that will enable corporations that are participating in the same industry to have consistent disclosure. One example is the Sustainable Apparel Coalition, which was founded 10 years ago, now includes 250 companies and actually provides tools and solutions on top of a framework to actually encourage the specific disclosure around ESG and sustainability specific practices in apparel. And then I think the final takeaway, and perhaps the most important one, is that purpose is not at the expense of profit, and that the two are inextricably linked. But we need to educate investors on this. We need to be very clear on which metrics we are tracking to actually support that statement and make those connections. So I think a uplifting point where we ended our discussion, but certainly a challenging one.
That's very important. Purpose not at the expense of profit. That's something that should be the overarching theme of ESG. So thank you. Emma Stewart.
Yes, hi. So we really had a discussion anchoring around three themes. One was clear rules of the road, which I've heard echoed by a number of different groups. A second was around how to organize internally. And a third was around data and automation. In that first category, I'll summarize by saying, bring it on. There was 100% consensus that we all welcomed the SEC's guidance. As examples, one company said, look, net zero and diversity and inclusion are decision criteria now for clients to hire us, for customers to work with us, and for job candidates to accept our job offers. So as another company put it, we don't want things assumed about our company that doesn't paint the whole picture. But the rules of the road haven't been clear, and so it's not evident what our canvas looks like to paint that picture. So that was one very clear outcome. A second was around how to organize internally. There was a general sentiment that ESG should report into the CFO and be a CFO responsibility. About half of us in the group already have that arrangement, and others who were there said, maybe we need to revisit and actually consider that org chart. One company was talking about creating parallel budgeting structures, so with business unit leaders responsible for financials and carbon. And so that company was saying, given that, the CFO really has to oversee this. This is a budgeting consideration. Another company talked about how they've integrated this into their corporate-wide enterprise risk management process that rolls up to the board. And a third talked about how, since so many emissions often lie in one supply chain, the procurement division, if you're lucky enough to have one, we at Netflix have a decentralized procurement approach, then they are really key collaborators in this. And then that third category was around data and automation. There was a sense that this is a fast growing field, a much needed service or SaaS opportunity, and that the software landscape is booming in this regard, but you're seeing a lot of small startups, not always particularly well capitalized. And so we were keen as a group to see the big ERP players enter with force, either through build or buy, to provide that level of CFO quality data and board quality data. That's it from our group.
Excellent. This is great feedback from all the discussion groups and themes of automation, welcoming standardization, and the importance of talents, and the purpose behind ESG was really discussed and brought to the forefront. So thank you so much for sharing, group leaders. Thank you. Well, thank you all for joining us today. A special thanks to our partner Workday for collaborating on this series. We hope to see you all back here on October 27th at 3 p.m. Eastern Time for our next virtual CFO Collaborative, when we will be discussing another hot topic for so many CFOs, the CFO's role in redefining the future of work. And we will be joined by Accenture's CEO, Julie Sweet. Until then, take good care.